Welcome to Bad Kids Don't Exist. This is the podcast that helps adults better understand kids to create environments where kids and their caregivers thrive. And today you have tuned into a very special episode where I do an interview with Dr. Rosa Li. Dr. Li is a teaching assistant professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at UNC Chapel Hill. She teaches undergraduate courses and has previously managed the Teens and Tech website, which is part of the Winston National Center on Technology Use, Brain, and Psychological Development. She has also previously taught decision sciences at Duke University and holds a PhD in psychology and neuroscience from Duke. We talk about kids and technology, how to keep kids safe, and some of the great things about allowing kids access. Let's check out this interview together. Well, Dr. Li, I am so excited to have you here with me talking about kids and technology and just the impact that technology has on kids' brains and all of the interesting research that you have done over at UNC and everything you're doing now to educate people about how technology really is having a big impact on kids today.
Thanks for having me.
I'd like to really jump right in and see just some things that you think are really interesting for maybe parents to know about kids and technology usage. And what I find really interesting is that the windows of opportunity where kids are very young and as they get older. So can you talk some about that?
Yeah, so I think a lot of times parents want to know, when should I get my kids a phone? When should I let them be on social media? Is it good or bad for them? And unfortunately, the nuanced science answer is it's not very satisfying. It depends. We don't know exactly when the perfect age would be. So we like to tell families it really depends on you and your kid. We also tell parents that you are the expert on your kid. So you know best who they are, what they are like, if they're mature enough to handle having a phone, if they're independent enough, things like that. So I tell parents to think about what are their kids like? Do they feel like they're responsible enough to have their own phone? And that can entail basic things like just being able to keep track of where it is and not losing a very expensive computer.
Yes.
Right. But it's also things like, are they old enough to recognize when they might be stumbling across something that is too mature for them to see? Or would they be comfortable coming to you if they're having some interaction through text or social media that might be problematic in some way? And that can be things like cyberbullying or sexting, unwanted explicit images, things like that. So we try to tell parents, have a conversation with their kids, ask them why they want a phone, ask them, what types of things do you think you are not ready to handle, and what is your plan if that happens? And the hope is that parents can build trust with their kids. The official recommendations from the American Psychological Association, which I think make a lot of sense, is, when kids are younger, start off with more monitoring. So maybe sit down with them, limit the number of apps they can use, monitor the apps or have access to them so you can go through and see what they're doing. And then as they get older, you can start taking off some of those training wheels as they earn your trust. It's similar to like with driving. We start off kids with learner's permits and they're under careful supervision. We give them lots of education. We don't just stick them behind the wheel and let them go. We're trying to say that phones should be similar, that they are tremendous tools. They can be really useful, but they can also be really damaging. And a way to prevent the harm is to make sure kids are really well educated on what those harms might be, that they're taught to use phones in a safe and productive way.
Yes. And talking about safe and productive, I know when I was growing up, it was really all about don't go on the internet and tell someone where you live. That was really what it came down to. Don't give out your personal identifying information. And it seems like that is still definitely something to consider, but there's more to it than that. It's about the impact, especially with all of the apps and the scrolling and everything else, the impact that has on kids' brains, like their actual brain functionality. Can you talk some about that and just what is happening in a kid's brain as they mindlessly scroll?
Yeah, so there's a few things to unpack there. So we at our center really focus on adolescents and their technology use, and we do that because adolescence is a really interesting time for brain development. Neuroscientists like to say that it's the second window of opportunity and plasticity, and that's second only to the first 3 years of life. So if you think about
Wow.
parents with newborns, they might spend a lot of time doing all this research of like, what's the best food for my kid's brain? What are the best toys? There are lots of companies that make a whole lot of money trying to market themselves as, being great for your baby's brain development. And we kind of forget, or maybe parents don't know, that teenagers' brains are almost just as malleable. That the hormonal changes of puberty that we can see affecting parts of their body and the way that their bodies are changing, it's also affecting how their brains are changing as well. So there are a couple of brain systems that are especially active during adolescence. So the first is the brain's reward processing system. So this is the part of our brain that teaches us what is going to give us a rewarding interaction. And
Okay.
we find things that, like adolescents, their brains are especially sensitive to reward. So if when they get reward, they have a bigger brain response than kids or adults do. They also do things like they are faster at learning from reward compared to kids and adults. The idea or the thought is that this is beneficial from an evolutionary perspective. When you're an adolescent, this is when you're just starting to become independent from your families.
Mm.
So it makes sense that you want to go out and seek out new and exciting experiences. However, if you put that in a technology context, with our phones, I like to say our phones are little slot machines that we can carry around with us.
Yes.
So, right, every time there's a new notification that pops up, you're like pulling that lever to see how much reward you're going to get out of it. And then, from a psychology term called variable reinforcement, we don't know exactly when those rewarding notifications are going to pop up, and so that prompts us potentially to want to constantly check and see if it's there.
Wow.
If you do the same thing with like a pigeon, for example, and you give it rewards at random times, they're just going to constantly peck away because they never know when that reward is coming. So the same idea with not just kids, even adults, right? We're constantly picking up our phones to
Oh
see if
yeah.
there's new and exciting to give us that little jolt of reward. So this can potentially be problematic for adolescents. They might be especially drawn to using their phones. And then the other big network that is especially active at this time is what we call our social processing network. So this is the parts of our brain that let us think about what other people are thinking. It lets us think about what other people might be thinking about us, which is something that adolescents are especially preoccupied with. It can make being with friends especially rewarding or especially important, but it can also mean being rejected by your friends or being rejected by your peers also hurts a lot more and is much more harmful. So again, we put that in the phone context. Our phones are a way that we can constantly access these social interactions. You don't have to be at school, or you don't have to be face to face with your friends anymore. You can get text on your phone. You can get messages through social media, right? Those messages, they don't have to come in real time. They could have been posted the day before. So in some ways, maybe really useful. It's another way for kids to connect with each other, potentially to solidify those social bonds. But again, the flip side is it's another way of potential harm that you can get bullied over your phone, or it's an avenue for FOMO, as the youth would say. So
Yes.
that fear of missing out, that you can see, hey, my friends are having fun at this party without me, or all my friends went to the mall and I wasn't invited, and that's something that I missed out on. So these are reasons why we think adolescents might be especially drawn to using their phones. And again, that can be for good or for bad. Um, and the last part of the brain that I talk about when it comes to adolescence is not something that's necessarily specific to adolescence, but it's this idea that the brain's control processes, so the brain's prefrontal cortex, this kind of front part of your head, that helps you do things like plan out your future, think through potential consequences, say, no, don't do that. This part of our brain is very slowly maturing across development, and it doesn't actually finish maturing until we're into our early 20s. So for adolescents, it's still going through that slow maturation process. So one theory is that these reward features of our brain, these social processing features of our brain, are especially active during adolescence, and our control processes of our brain, they just haven't caught up yet, developmentally speaking. So this can be a time when our phones, again, are really alluring because they're a gateway to reward, a gateway to our friends, and then the part of our brain that's like, maybe it's time to stop and go to sleep. or maybe it's time to stop and get your homework done first, those quite aren't quite as mature. They're not kind of strong enough to overwhelm that desire to be on our phones.
I think that is so interesting and so important because I hear a lot of times as a therapist, like the kid won't put their phone down. And I have to remind parents, like, they're not going to be able to do that on their own. you, they don't have that part of their brain, that limiting part of their brain. And I talk all the time on my podcast about the prefrontal
Yeah,
cortex and how in kids, it's just not there. It's just
that's
not
right.
working. So it's our job as the adults to help them come up with those limits. And as we institute those policies or the schedule of it, then their brain picks up on that. And that's where it can actually start to learn to do it.
Yeah, and I do
One,
also just want to interject and
yeah,
point out too that it's not just teens that have a hard time putting down their phones. Adults have a hard time
yes,
too. So if you're talking to
yes.
parents, right, ask them one thing we also say is, think about your own phone use, your own device use, and now think about putting that in the hands of someone who is more mature than you are. And it's hard, and it's hard because they're designed to be alluring. That these tech companies spend a lot of money. They hire a lot of really smart people, a lot of people with PhDs in fields like psychology, to design their apps and to design their features to keep people on their phones as long as possible. So in some ways, we're kind of, with our phones trying to resist using them. We're also trying to resist like these forces of capitalism and marketing as well.
Because they make money. The more we are on the app, the more we're on the website, whatever. Like YouTube, YouTube is created to keep you on YouTube. They don't care if you're learning, they care that you're on YouTube. And
Exactly.
you had talked about I can't remember the term that you used about rewards where it's intermittent, it's not a predictable reward.
Yeah, an intermittent reinforcement schedule.
The intermittent reinforcement schedule. Um, that is something that happens a lot in addiction, especially gambling addiction, where actually the loss makes you want to play more. So if you lose at the poker game or lose at the slot machine on your phone, where you check your phone and it's not there, and maybe you check it 3 times and it's not, and then the fourth time you check it and it is, then it tells you like, oh, you need to keep checking it because maybe this next time you check it there will be something there.
Yeah.
And so are there things that can help parents help their kids kind of mitigate that, especially the addiction? You mentioned watching your own usage. And I cannot tell you how many parents I've talked to where they say, my kid is always on their phone. And then when we walk out into the lobby after their kids session, they shut down the 35 apps that they have had open on their phone while we've been in session. But are there things that adults can do to help the kids?
Yeah, so this is the place where I think the research has not caught up with reality as much as we'd like. So there are recommendations that we can give based on what we think is helpful, but we just really don't have that much like research-backed evidence. We don't have like clinical trial data yet about what is like especially effective. And part of that is there's still a lot of argument about, what exactly is the best way for kids to use their phones or what needs to be curtailed. Um, so I think a few things that we tell parents, again, it's pretty individual by family. So you know your kids. Um, we recommend having discussions with your kids. What do you think is appropriate? So, right, what are the rules that we have for our family? Is it that there are no phones at the dinner table? And that would apply for everyone, parents and kids included. Is it you're allowed to use your phone, after homework is done, or 30 minutes of homework and you get a 10-minute screen time break, things like that. The one recommendation that we do have that is very evidence driven is to stop phone usage in the hour or two before bedtime. And that is based on a lot of very compelling work showing that using screens before bedtimes is really disruptive for sleep. And we know sleep is really important throughout the lifespan, but also especially during adolescence. Sleep is the time when the brain is recovering, it's rebuilding itself. And we actually have research showing that if you get really like variable, uncertain amounts of sleep, like maybe you get a few hours this night and then a lot of sleep the next night, if that sleep is really variable in quality and duration, that your brain's white matter tracts do not develop as well
Oh,
in
wow.
across adolescence. So we can see that poor sleep is actually harmful to the brain. Um, so no screens, ideally the hour or two before bed. We have some research from our center now looking at actually using data from the screen time app on iPhones on how often you're picking up your phone, finding that for teenagers, if they're picking up their phones in the middle of the night, then they tend to be awake when they're doing that. So it's not just like, oh, do I have any notifications? It's I'm picking up my phone, now I'm engaging my phone, now I'm awake instead of asleep at 3 o'clock in the morning. Um, so one recommendation might not be popular, but one recommendation is don't have phones in the bedroom, have a common charging spot somewhere else in the house. And that might mean doing things like buying a physical alarm clock instead of relying on your phone to wake you up. Um, but I think the cleanest recommendations we have, or the most research-backed recommendations we have, is definitely try to be really good about maintaining what we call sleep hygiene. So no screens close to bedtime, um, no screens in the bedroom overnight. Um, there are other things like what apps kids can use or how they're allowed to use them. I think that is going to be dependent on the age of the kids, and again, that how responsible they are, how mature they are. Right? You can grab two 13-year-olds, and they can be vastly different in terms of maturity level. So that's kind of something for parents to figure out on their own. Um, there's an I've been reading a lot lately about this company, or I don't know, it's a company, a nonprofit called Wait Until Eighth, which is a group that's trying to get families to wait until eighth grade to give kids their phones. We'll
Oh,
say that again, there's no like research study that I could point to say that eighth grade is the age when kids are definitely ready. But we have learned from conversations with families that so I had one parent tell me, you don't want your kid to be the first kid or the last kid to get a phone. And things like wait until eighth, this is where you get like community members to pledge to wait until eighth grade to give their kids a phone. That might make it easier for families that want to delay giving their kids their first phones. Um, that if the whole school is doing it or your whole peer group is doing it, then your kid is not the one feeling left out about it. And having that extra time to potentially mature might be a good thing. So I kind of tell people, like, from a science perspective, I can't say that there is research saying that, yes, that is definitely the right way to go. But if I had a teenager myself right now, I would try to get, my kids' peer group to sign on to something like that to try to wait as long as possible.
I think one thing that comes up a lot with parents is they don't want to be the unpopular parent or the weird parent. And so many times in discussions like this, it almost comes down to you might just have to be the weird one at
Yeah.
times. And it doesn't mean, maybe not the first, maybe not the last, but you might have to be the unpopular one with your child for a while. And that's
Yeah, I've
okay.
had parents ask me, they'll say like, my kid is one of just a handful who doesn't have phones yet. Do you have any research on like whether that's good or bad for them? And I have to tell them we just don't know because that research doesn't exist. It's a challenging population to try to recruit, right? If there's only like one or two kids
Yes.
in the school, it's not easy to do that research. And I also do want to note that there are a lot of positives for kids to have access to phones and social media. There is potentially a lot of socialization that can happen there. Um, Kids can report finding support online. This is especially true for kids who might have marginalized identities. If they're not getting the support that they need in
Yeah.
person, they can find that support online. And we just don't know if those benefits might outweigh the potential harms of things like not getting good quality sleep, potentially being exposed to more bullying online, stuff like that.
That was going to be my next question was, is there research that shows some positive things? Because we hear all the time about all of the negatives, and it definitely with marginalized communities and things like that. Is there any research that's been done about, um, I guess it's called mediated communication, where you don't actually have to say it to someone. You can just type it. You can just text it or put it in an app or something like that, where either kids are more likely to talk about things that they wouldn't talk about in person, or ways for them to find positive help across technology.
Yeah, so I think what you're talking about is so one feature of social media that's different from traditional interactions is that it can be asynchronous, right? So if you ask me a question and I don't answer for several minutes, it's kind of awkward and weird. But if you sent me a text and it took me a few minutes to respond, that's just kind of the way it goes. And so there's research showing that for kids who might be socially anxious, that can actually be really beneficial for them to have
Ah,
that bit of delay time, that they can think about what they want to say, they can like rehearse it or go back and delete and edit whatever. Um, so that kind of time lag that we have seems to be really beneficial for anxious kids. There are also some work suggesting that kids who might be exploring their own identity, so this is more for kids who might be exploring their gender or sexuality, um, the anonymous nature of social media might make it easier for them to do that exploration because they can't be, linked back to um, their real people. So they can try on different personas in a relatively safe way. And this is something also. We tend to think about this in the context of kids who are trying on marginalized identities, but I think this also applies to, I guess, more like everyday kids who might be still trying to figure out who they are, maybe not necessarily in quite such a loaded way, but it's also another way where they can try out different sides of themselves. I think a popular thing that kids have, I don't know if kids actually call this, they have their Instagram accounts and their Finstagram accounts, so their fake Instagrams. And
yes.
sometimes those Finsta accounts are, they only have like their closest circle of friends. Um, what's the word I'm looking for? Like allowed to follow them, or it's private and only their closest circle of friends can see it, and that's where they can be like their real selves. They don't have to put on the social media persona. Um, so that kind of like the things like the time delay and the way you can kind of curate your audience on social media might be really beneficial for kids who are trying to figure out how they want to present themselves to the world or to different populations that they interact with.
Great. And are there any just hard no's with kids and technology?
Yes, so there are a few hard no's. If you, so the American Psychological Association put out, I forget what they called it, like a health advisory or a health bulletin, and a lot of it is like what I've been saying, where there's a lot of equivocal statements. So, this is good, but this could also be bad. Like this is bad, but this could also be good. The few hard no's, any content that advocates self-harm, kids should not be viewing that content. It's tricky. The research on kids who engage in self-injurious thoughts and behaviors,
Ah, yes.
kids who engage in self-harm, in some cases, um, potentially if they're finding support and saying like, if you're doing this behavior, you should stop. You should tell your parents. You should tell a trusted teacher, right? Get help. That can be a positive, but there are a lot of communities online where they will say things like, this is how you hide it from your family, or they might normalize it. So that is very clearly, that is not okay. That has been linked to more increasing these self-harm behaviors. So that is a hard, like any communities that advocate for doing these behaviors, that's a bad. Um, Similarly, there are these really unfortunate communities. They're pro-ana or pro-mia, so pro-anorexia and pro-bulimia sites. The main tech platforms have actually done a really good job banning this content. So if you try to search for something like Finspiration in Instagram, for example, it doesn't pull up anything. It'll tell you like these are the resources you need if you are having trouble with eating disorders. So that's, I think, a plus for the big social media platforms. However, these communities still exist. If you Google them, you can find them. They exist in smaller communities. They exist in things like Discord servers, which are privately managed. And these are places where people get, I don't know what the right word is, like advice about how to restrict their eating or hide their problematic eating behaviors. They'll post what they call Finspiration photos, which are really, for me, very challenging to look at. These are people who are
Yeah.
extremely like emaciated. They have they'll have like contests about and like share how little they ate and like cheer each other on. So
Wow.
these communities extremely problematic. You might know as a counselor, Mr. Stu, that anorexia is the mental health disorder with the highest mortality rate. These are very extremely dangerous behaviors, and there are websites out there that can promote these rather than pushing people to seek help. So those are the two types of content that the American Psychological Association has very clearly said, like, this should be banned, this should not be allowed to exist. So if for the parents who are watching this, if you notice anything like this in your kids' search history, anything in the types of content that they're viewing, like that needs to be a very serious conversation and probably I recommend also seeking out help from a trained mental health professional as well.
Yeah, and especially during those windows of opportunity, and while the child is on this device that they're getting flooded with all this reward chemical already, to have that paired with something as dangerous as self-injurious behaviors or eating disorders, that is a cocktail that we do not want to mess with, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, and eating disorders specifically are challenging during adolescence, partly because of that I talked about that, caring about social interactions and how your peer group is judging you might lead you to care a lot about your physical appearance or whether you do or do not fit up to whatever standard of attractiveness is being held up. And also, puberty is a time when your body might be changing in ways that you may or may not like. For young girls, it might be pushing you away from that thin ideal. If you are going through puberty at a slower rate or faster rate than your peers, that can also affect the thoughts that you have about your bodies. So it's a really sensitive time. It has mostly been studied in young girls because they are the bulk of folks who have these eating disorders. But I think now boys and young men are also being exposed to really problematic messages about how they should look. And a lot of that, or some of that, is also facilitated through social media as well.
Yeah. And are there ways that you see as the best or maybe the easiest ways for parents to monitor their kids' usage of technology?
Yeah, so I think one recommendation that I'm seeing a lot is co-viewing with your kids. So maybe once a week or so, like sit down with your kids, have them show you what they're seeing in their feeds.
Ah, that's a
Because the
great
challenge
idea.
Yeah, so it's the challenge now with social media is it used to like in early days, it used to be you would only see the accounts that you follow, right? And so that's gonna really you can curate what you see. You don't have to worry about extra stuff coming in. But now everything's about the algorithm, this competition for your eyeballs and your attention, and all kinds of random stuff can end up popping up in your social media feeds. Just like as a personal example, I've been taking pottery classes just for fun. So my Instagram feed, I started following pottery stuff, and now actually used to avoid looking at these videos, but now I'm watching these pottery videos, and I like to joke. It starts off as pottery videos, and it always ends up something in some weird corner of the internet that I didn't realize I was headed towards until I'm there. And it's usually like, I don't know, 30, 40 minutes later. And so that same thing that can happen to you, which is like, wait, I was looking at pottery, now why am I looking at this weird, I don't know, food video or something even more bizarre than that? That same thing can happen to your kids as well. That maybe they're, I don't know what kids are into, watching some video about Minecraft, and then all of a sudden they're watching some content that might not be appropriate, that you don't think they should be seeing. So
Yeah,
I think
I
wait, oh, sorry,
I
go ahead.
just I just had a parent who was really concerned about their child's YouTube history, but the child had started watching Fortnite dances. They were trying to learn how to do these dances. Then it turned into twerking videos, and by the end it was butts. I mean, and it
Yeah,
was literally that was the name of the videos were just butts. And
yeah,
it's that
that's
rabbit hole.
yeah, and it can happen pretty quickly. Um, Yeah, so I think one of the so what the anecdote you mentioned, one way potentially is like watch with your kids, like know what they're seeing online. And then for things like YouTube, where they keep track of the history that you're viewing, like go and look and see what your kids are being exposed to. I think yours is a great example. Like it's not a bad kid. This wasn't a kid who was trying to look at butts or things that were
Yeah.
more mature than he was ready for. But this is just what's getting served up to them. And right now, we're still at a state place where the regulations have not caught up to the reality, right? Like research moves slowly, politics, I don't know which moves slower, probably politics, maybe even slower. In some cases, when you think about the tech folks, their one of their mottos was like move fast, break things, right? Do the thing and then deal with the consequences later. Get in there before they can stop you. Um, and I think we're getting to enough political momentum where I think people are starting to realize like we need some rules, we need to protect our kids. Um, on the flip side, I feel like they've been talking about this for quite some time now, and it doesn't seem like they're getting much closer to agreeing on anything. There have been a few states that have been outright banning use of social media for kids under certain ages. Um, I personally think that is not, I'd say that is a very blunt weapon
Hmm.
that is going to be very hard to enforce. Um, so it might send like an interesting public health message that, we as the state are saying this shouldn't happen, but that's not going to solve all our problems.
And it doesn't build that ability in kids. It's just controlling them rather than helping them learn how to control themselves.
Yeah.
Um, well, as we come to the end of our conversation, if one thing that I think about with kids and technology is kind of how smoking used to be. It used to be that just everybody smoked. And then one day it was like, oh my goodness, no one should ever smoke. No one should be doing this. And sometimes technology seems like it's going to be that way. Like we look back and we're like, oh my goodness, what in the world were we thinking? So if you were going to say in 10 years or 20 years or 50 years, when we look back on kids and technology, what do you think we're going to think about all of this?
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting question to ask. Smoking, I think in some ways we can think about like big tech, similar to big tobacco, that they have, profit motives that might be at odds with health motives. But on the flip side, to push back a little bit, I think it's not quite the right analogy. Smoking doesn't really have that many benefits, and the harms are
Right.
pretty clear cut. I prefer my analogy that I prefer is food and diet, right? So you say in the same way you have these giant companies that are developing what do they call what's the term now? Like highly palatable foods or highly processed foods that are again like very carefully scientifically engineered to be as delicious as possible. Um, and but we also recognize that there's good food and bad food, right? There's some foods that are better for you, some foods that you should have only in moderation. And in the same way, I think when we look back and like, oh, 10 years ago, everyone thought that like fat was the worst thing that you could have in your diet. And now we realize that actually maybe it's like really refined sugar, or too many refined carbs. And maybe in another 10 years, we'll think, oh, we were so wrong about that. It was this thing. So I think that might be closer to what we see with social media, that there are, or technology, right? There are very clear benefits. They make us connected. It's making this interview possible today. But there are also potential harms that we can mitigate. And in the same way that we think about addressing things like childhood obesity, we are thinking about taking that as a multi-pronged approach, right? So we try to educate kids and families about what would constitute a healthy diet. Those are things that pediatricians should be monitoring for their families. Maybe it's time we have pediatricians start talking to their parents about, what are you doing for screen time? Are you monitoring screen time or not? We have laws about what school lunches can look like, that they have to have certain compositions of foods. We have some laws, more in some countries than others, about how food can be advertised to kids. I'm trying to think what else there is, right? We have policies in place. So it's a very complex food and diet is very complex, and we have to tackle this from multiple approaches. And I think we should think about technology use in the same way, that it's not enough to put all the responsibility on just parents or just teachers to have, this digital tech class, and that is supposed to make kids safe tech consumers, that there's some responsibility on the tech companies, there's some responsibility on regulating what the tech companies can and can't produce or market towards kids. And then at the end of it, we'll kind of see what happens, right? That we haven't actually solved our nation's health crises related to food. But maybe we're getting there.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Li, thank you so much for joining me today and just being able to have this conversation. If parents are wanting to find out more, or they're wanting to just learn more about technology usage and all that, is there a place where they can go either to learn more about that or learn more about you and the work that you do?
Yeah, so our center has a website. It's winstoncenter.unc.edu. I don't know I feel like you two have seen, like, we'll put a link in the description.
Yes, yep, we'll put it
I don't know
in the description for sure.
Great. Common Sense Media is a really great resource. They have all kinds of stuff there for parents. They have, there's a curriculum about digital technology use, um, everything from cyberbullying to what are passwords and why should we keep them safe. One of our collaborators at the Winston Center, Jackie Nisi, she's a professor at Brown. She writes this really wonderful newsletter called Techno Sapiens. So it comes out once a week, I believe. She's a parent herself. She's one of the earliest researchers in the space of social media and mental health. So that's a really wonderful resource. There's a couple of books that I recommend. One is called Media Moms and Digital Dads. That's by Yalda Oels. She had a really fascinating career. She used to be a Hollywood executive. I think she maybe worked for like MGM or something like that, and then decided, I don't know, she was done having a glamorous life and was going to go get her PhD. So she has this background in media and also a PhD in psychology and development. So she has a book about media use that's geared towards parents. She does a lot of really cool work as well.
And we will link all of that in the description. I wrote it all down, and I'll look it all up and make sure it's sitting there nice and pretty for everybody.
Yeah, send me an email if there's anything you can't find.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, and thank you for the work that you do. It's important, and it's important for more people to know more about it. So thank you.
Great, and I'll say the same to you as well.
There are some great things about technology, and we shouldn't say that all technology is bad, and we definitely shouldn't say that kids who enjoy using technology are bad kids. Because remember, some things exist, some things don't. Bad kids don't exist. I love helping adults better understand kids so that kids and their caregivers can thrive. If that sounds like a good match for you and your next event, click the link in the description to this video or head over to badkidsdon'texist.com/booking, and there you'll find all the information you need to hire me as a keynote speaker or a workshop leader. I can't wait to partner with you and make your next event a great one.